Today, we're diving into over 300 years of the Dutch Empire in Indonesia. And, it's a story that's really framed by two very different men, separated by centuries, but they're connected by this chillingly similar use of violence. Think of them as the brutal bookends of an empire. And their stories? Well, they tell us a pretty disturbing truth about how that empire was built and how it was held together.
All right, so to understand the whole story, we're actually going to start at the end. We're talking about the years right after World War II. It's an incredibly chaotic, violent time. The Netherlands is desperately trying to get its colonies back from Indonesian nationalists, who, by the way, have just declared their independence.
Yeah, just take a second to really look at this image. This is the village of Rawageda on December 19th, 1947. What happened was Dutch troops were hunting for guerrilla fighters, but when they couldn't find them, they rounded up the village's men and executed them, systematically. The official Dutch count was 150 dead, but Indonesian authorities, they say it was 431. And, even a UN investigation back then called it deliberate and ruthless.
Okay, so hold that image, that reality, in your mind, because now, listen to this. Decades later, after a long legal battle fought by the widows of Rawageda, the Dutch state finally apologized. But, and this is a huge but, listen to the careful wording. They apologized for specific cases, not for the war, and definitely not for their colonial past in general. The violence was framed as just excesses. And trust me, that language is not an accident. It's a huge piece of the puzzle here.
So who was the architect behind a lot of these actions? Well, that would be this guy, Captain Raymond Westerling. He was the leader of a special forces unit, a real specialist in counterinsurgency. And his methods, they were famous for being two things: incredibly effective and absolutely terrifyingly brutal. He actually perfected a set of tactics so distinct they got their own name, the Westerling method. And you can see the pattern right here. His guys would surround a village, usually in the middle of the night, herd all the men into one spot, then informants would point out suspected resistance fighters, who were then executed, right there on the spot, in front of everyone. See, this wasn't just about killing enemies. No, this was about using pure terror to pacify an entire region. And the thing is, it worked, but it left thousands and thousands of people dead.
Okay, so this all leads to the big question, right?
Was this violence, this Westerling method, just an exception? Was it just a desperate, ugly act by a dying empire? Or was this kind of brutality actually built into the very foundation of Dutch rule from the beginning? To answer that, we need to rewind the clock. And I don't mean by a few years. I mean we have to go back centuries, all the way to the very start. So let's jump back to 1602. The Dutch East India Company, you'll know it as the VOC, is founded. And you have to get this. This was not just a trading company. It was basically a corporation with the powers of a state. It had its own army, its own navy, and the power to wage war. And in 1619, it found the perfect guy to lead its charge, Governor General Jan Pieterszoon Koen. For hundreds of years, this is exactly how Koen was remembered in the Netherlands, as a national hero. I mean, he was the guy whose ambition supposedly built the Dutch Golden Age. His statue is still standing in his hometown, but behind that heroic image is a foundation built on violence that is just almost unimaginable.
Just look at that number, 15,000, down to 1,000.
That is the approximate reduction of the population of the Banda Islands. In 1621, Koen invaded them to get a complete monopoly on the nutmeg trade. Yeah, nutmeg. His forces just systematically wiped out the local people through massacres, starvation, slavery, you name it. Out of about 15,000 people, maybe 1,000 survived. It's an act that historians today don't mince words about. They call it clearly genocidal. So now we have our two bookends, right? Koen back in the 17th century and Westerling in the 20th. I mean, on the surface, they seem like they're from totally different worlds. But when you really start to look closer, a chillingly consistent pattern starts to show up. I mean, look at this when you put them side by side. The parallels are they're undeniable. Yeah, different centuries, different employers, one's a company, one's a state, but the fundamental goal, it was identical: absolute control. And the method to get there was the same too: ruthless, exemplary violence. Violence that wasn't just designed to defeat an enemy, but to terrorize an entire population into submission. You know, there's actually a term for this. The historian Hank Schulte-Nordholt calls it a state of violence. And the idea behind it is really powerful. It basically means that this extreme violence wasn't an oops. It wasn't an exception to the rule. No, it was the rule. It was the system. The entire colonial structure was built on what he calls a regime of fear, where the threat of insane force was just always there, hanging over everyone's heads.
And to hide this brutal reality, a very specific kind of language was created. Just look at these terms. Huge military invasions weren't called wars. Nope, they were police actions. These ruthless counterinsurgency campaigns, they were called pacification or cleansing. And like we already saw, systemic war crimes were just brushed off as unfortunate excesses. It was a way of using language to make the unthinkable sound almost bureaucratic, acceptable even.
And all of this brings us right up to the present day. Because this history, it's not settled, not by a long shot. It's still deeply, deeply contested. It's remembered and forgotten in completely different ways depending on who you ask. And honestly, this slide shows that clash perfectly. On the left, you've got the statue of Kumin, the celebrated hero. And on the right, an Indonesian propaganda poster showing the devilish Dutch. I mean, these are two totally opposing views of the exact same history. They just can't both be true at the same time. See, in Indonesia, this violence isn't some historical footnote. It's a central part of their national identity. The oppression, the massacres, it's all woven into the heroic story of their long struggle for freedom. Hearing about someone like Westerling isn't some big shock. For many, it's just a confirmation of the stories they've heard their whole lives. But in the Netherlands, well, the process has been a lot slower and way more painful. For decades, the main story was one of a benevolent mission, just tainted by a few unfortunate excesses. It's really only been in the last 20 years or so that a real public reckoning with the idea of systemic war crimes has even started. And this shift, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was forced. It was forced by things like tenacious lawsuits from Indonesian widows who just refused to let the world forget. It was forced by court rulings that shattered old legal defenses. And it was forced by the shocking discovery of old photos of actual executions that suddenly made the reality impossible to ignore anymore. So that leaves us with one last really difficult question. When the very beginning of a 300-year empire and its violent end are both defined by massacres, how are you supposed to tell the story of everything that happened in between? How do you do that honestly?